Yes, indeed, it's time for Mark Meets, in which I speak to the biggest names in the world of politics, sport, showbiz and beyond. Tonight, one of the best-known politicians in the country, George Galloway. Born in Dundee, George was the youngest ever chairman of the Scottish Labour Party in 1981. Now, that's actually when they were quite popular. And he was General Secretary of the London-based charity War on Want from 1983 until his election as MP for Glasgow Hillhead, later Glasgow Kelvin, in the 1987 general election. George campaigned tirelessly against the Iraq War, which won't have gone down well with his colleagues in New Labour, who dispatched him from the party in 2003. George then became a member of the Respect Party and ultimately its leader. He stood for Respect in the 2005 general election for Bethnal Green and Bow, defeating the sitting Labour MP Una King. And he was back in the Commons, winning the Bradford West by-election in 2012. George Galloway was a keen Brexiteer, even lending his support to Nigel Farage's Brexit party in the European parliamentary elections of 2019. I should stress he lent his vote to Nigel on that occasion. George has also made a name for himself as a brilliant broadcaster, fronting shows on talk radio and latterly RT. George enjoys two things in particular: standing for election and getting married, the latter of which he's done 4 times. Also happy to embrace any platform, George starred in Series 4 of Celebrity Big Brother. During his time on the programme, he mimed licking imaginary milk whilst pretending to be a cat from the cupped hands of actress Rula Lenska, a task handed to them by Big Brother producers, I hasten to add. Whether you agree with this man or disagree with him, you certainly can't ignore him. And George Galloway, welcome to GB News.
Welcome. Fabulous introduction. Thank you, Mark.
And I know that you have found a resting place for your heart in the current and final Mrs. Galloway.
Absolutely, yes. And although I have been married more than once, I've never had a stag do. So I wouldn't be able to contribute much to your later discussion on that. They all seem simply awful to me.
Are you a lifelong teetotaler?
Yes, and my father before me, God rest him, and my children after me, I earnestly hope. Yes, I am militantly against alcohol and drugs, and there's enough stupefaction in the world already. We don't need artificial means of doing it.
Have you ever tried a drink, George?
Never. I have never tasted it, nor have I even seen a drug. I literally don't know what a drug looks like. And I hope that my children go through their lives in exactly the same way. But of course, you can't legislate for that. But I do think that drink is the curse of the working class. That's how I was brought up by my militantly teetotal father. He used to take us to the window, show us that we lived in a very poor slum area, and then a vast council housing estate. And he would show us the men staggering home from the pub and tell us how their wives and children would go short as a result.
So would you argue that corporations and the state has historically used alcohol to help with the enslavement of the working class?
I kind of do. I think it's a pacification. If you look at what's happened to the black political class in Britain, when I first became involved in British politics in the 1970s, black people in Britain were in the front line of militant political organization and activity, and that's no longer true. Of course, things change. I appreciate that alcohol isn't as prevalent on the streets as it was. You don't see the kind of drunk men I saw growing up, but it appears that people are drinking at home because supermarket booze is cheaper, and also, lamentably, more and more people are taking drugs.
Yes. Now, George, your alcohol-free status, would that explain for your colossal energy?
Well, it does help. You're up like a spring in the morning compared to people who've had a skinful the night before. I've seen that, particularly in my early years, decades in the Scottish Labour and trade union movement, you don't have enough time for me to explain the brilliant, stellar careers that were ruined by excessive drinking. One of my closest friends, the leader of the Scottish Trade Union Congress, actually basically drank himself to death at a very young age. And many others, Lawrence Daly, the miners' leader, could have been one of the biggest names in British political history, but blew it all with drink. So I've all my life found more and more evidence that my father was right about that and many other things.
I'm sure there's no doubt about that. And poor old Charles Kennedy as well, the former leader of the Lib Dems, met a similar fate, didn't he, George? Another very talented Scottish politician. Were you always destined for a career in politics, George?
Yes, my mother from Irish immigrant stock and my father, a Scottish trade unionist, created a political household. It was a tiny one, but it was a salon of sorts. It was Formica breakfast bar that we used to sit at, but the conversation could have been at the table of Dorothy Parker. It was politics and satire and humor. It was truly wonderful to grow up in such an atmosphere. It wasn't the Algonquin. It was a council housing estate in Dundee, but it produced some bon mot.
No doubt, and you of course joined the Labour Party, and you made your way up their ranks. At what point did the party change to the extent that there was no longer a place for you in it? Was it the arrival of Tony Blair as leader, George?
Yes, although I did see it happen before that. I mean, he didn't come out of nowhere. I joke that the decline of the British Labour movement began when we used to be asked at weekend schools and summer schools to sit in a circle rather than in serried ranks and hear the words of expert political leaders. Then we were sitting in a workshop in a circle, and every person's opinion was worth the same as the next. And that's simply not true, of course. I came to these things wanting to hear Mr. Healy or Mr. Ben, not Big Senga from Facebook. But that's how things developed. And Labour became overcome by what I call liberalism. It's a small L, liberalism. I don't mean to upset my good friend Lembit Opik, but liberalism with a small L is the curse, not just of the working class, but of the working class movement. The idea that individuality, individualism, self, me, now is what I trace the decline of the British Labour Party and much of the left too. They began to prioritize identity politics, race, gender, sexual orientation, and now the rights of people to change their gender. And it's all disappeared up its own fundament.
Yes, we heard in an interview with Camilla Tominey in the Telegraph today the words of Stella Creasy, Labour MP, J.K. Rowling is wrong. A woman can have a penis. I need some help with that, George.
Yeah, don't we all? The idea that Labour can come back to power in Britain when one of their leading spokespeople makes comments like that, and others, belly aching about the flag of their own country flying in Regent Street in the heart of their own capital on the occasion of the 70th Jubilee of the head of state of our country. They're aliens, Mark. They're alien to the country. They don't like it very much, and they find it increasingly difficult to disguise that fact. And don't get me started on Emily Thornberry and the English flag. If they hate the British flag, they hate the English flag even more.
Does Labour, the modern Labour Party, have an issue with the working class of this country?
Absolutely. When I entered Parliament, it's not an aeon ago, 1987, there were well over 100 people like me that had come from the factory, come from the trade unions. And we even had a trade union room in which I used to sit in dull moments. And there it was, full of men with white shirts and ties and braces, but metaphorically, the working boots still on their feet. And we'd talk about the docks and the mines and the factories and the mills and the workshops. That was the last era in which any such large group of people could be in Parliament. I doubt if I could count on one hand, I doubt if I'd need one hand to count the number of people now in the Parliamentary Labour Party who, like me, came from the ranks of the working class, from the shop floor. And it shows. They don't like working class people and their rough ideas and rough habits and their failure to observe the correct pronouns and nomenclature. And increasingly it shows. And the working people hate them back. And that's why Boris Johnson got an 80-seat majority. That's why the so-called red wall, which was never all that red, but it was Labour, crumbled. Because Brexit was if you like, the breaking point. It was the catalyst for a real big change in British politics. Not necessarily because of the European Union, pros and cons, but because of the attitude of the left, including, of course, the serried ranks of liberalism in the BBC and in the smart papers that despised the people who voted for Brexit, thought that they were thick for having done so, or even racist for having done so. And of course, when you start describing people in such ways, they're going to hate you back. And that's what happened. That's why Corbyn lost the 2019 election so heavily and Johnson won it. Of course, the Tories have done their best to throw that majority away in the last couple of years, but maybe we'll come to that later.
Well, indeed. You vociferously spoke out against the Iraq war. Talk about the right side of history.
Yes, well, I noticed that Tony Blair's son has just bought a £22 million house. I think he's still in his 20s. So where there's muck, there's brass. The Blairs have done well, but I fear that at the pearly gates and the judgment day, they'll fare less well. I was right about Iraq. All the people that traduced me, called me mad and bad or both, all look foolish, historically speaking. Although, got to say, Mark, none of them lost their jobs. They went on to continue to pontificate in all the future wars. So accountability isn't a strong suit of the Britain that we have now. Once upon a time, people guilty of gross malfeasance and incompetence paid for it with their jobs, at least. But nowadays, they go on and on and on.
Yes, indeed they do. Let's take a look, George, at one of your greatest hits. Facing questions from the US Senate amid allegations that you had profited from Iraqi oil sales and that you were too close to Saddam Hussein. Take a look at this.
I know that standards have slipped over the last few years in Washington, but for a lawyer, you're remarkably cavalier with any idea of justice. I'm here today, but last week, you already found me guilty. You traduced my name around the world without ever having asked me a single question, without ever having contacted me, without ever having written to me or telephoned me.
Well done, Joe, for selecting that clip. There you go, George. You took them down. You took them down to Chinatown.
Yes, when I came out of the hearing, a black janitor came up and high-fived me. It was the first time I had ever been high-fived. And he said, "Way to go, man. You just sent George Bush back to his ranch." At which point I lit up a Cuban cigar inside the Capitol, breaking the law doubly. It was a very good day, my best day so far, I always say. There might be better days to come, who knows. But without a doubt, it was the Americans lifting a huge stone only to drop it on their own feet. It made me somebody in America. The New York Post headline, memorable, it's on my wall, Brit fries American senators in oil. It was a wonderful headline. And most people, my political enemies included, conceded that it was a performance. They, as George Bush would put it, they misunderestimated me. They looked at this, that my CV, working class, Catholic schoolboy from the mean streets of Dundee, and there I was in front of them in the Senate. It was a triumph for parliamentary debating standards, as existed back then at least, over the more princely royal court type atmosphere in the US Senate. They weren't used to someone speaking back to them in those terms. So, yeah, I think I did well. God was with me that day. And subsequently, I've toured America. They even pay people to give speeches in America, Mark. Did you know that?
Who knew?
I've become something of a figure in the United States. Not Shea Stadium, not the Beatles, but something of a figure in America.
Well, a towering one in my book. A fascinating conversation. The clock's against us, George. What this conversation demonstrates is that we need more time. Let's do it again very soon. Deeply grateful to you for joining us. George Galloway, political firebrand, broadcaster, and much, much more.